This is Next Radio.
With Broadcast Bionics. Innovative solutions for creative people.
Imagine if your commute was 18 minutes long, but you wanted to listen to some really nice radio with a beginning, a middle, and an end in that 18 minutes. Well, BBC R&D may have the answer. With more on that, here's Tony Churnside. Tony.
We'll skip that slide. Yeah, so I'm from BBC R&D, but don't worry, I don't have any graphs or equations in my talk. Well, that's not quite true, actually, but I've got 8 minutes to tell you about the future of broadcasting, so I better get a move on. Let me start here in the past, where things were quite simple. We had mono transmitters, and all radios looked pretty much like that wooden box that you can see there. As a broadcaster, all we needed to worry about, really, was not blowing up transmitters. Broadcasting is a compromise. It has always been a compromise. But we didn't worry about that. We didn't need to. This is how people listen to content. There wasn't a massive, diverse range of listening environments. But things have changed now. You can listen to radio on lots of people listen to radio on anything. You can get a toaster that plays radio. In fact, the BBC, you can consume BBC content on around 650 different devices. But if we knew the system that was being used to consume our content, if we knew the environment where our listeners were when they were listening, and perhaps a little more controversially, if we knew a little bit about our listeners, what their interests were, how would that change the way that we tell stories? Well, that's the kind of question that we started with when we started working on a project that we've termed responsive radio. I imagine most people in here are familiar with the term responsive web design, where websites are represented as a collection of assets and some metadata, and those assets are presented to the audience differently depending on the device they use. So your website looks great, whether on a tablet, whether on a desktop or a mobile. We borrowed the term and applied it to radio because the concept is really similar. What happens if we represent a radio program now as a selection of common assets that can be assembled and put together in different ways, depending on certain things, the device that was being used to consume the content, the environment the listener's in, how much time the listener has, for example. Theoretically, how does this approach impact on how we make radio? Is it still broadcasting? Well, how radio content is made now, assets have gone out, they're collected, they're assembled into a program, and that program is then packaged up and broadcast out to our audiences. And it's a single experience that we send to everyone. And quite often we're guilty of assuming that everyone is getting a parallel experience. But a couple of the slides I've shown so far demonstrate this clearly isn't the case anymore. The variety of listening conditions mean that the actual quality of experience is vastly different for different people who are listening in different places. But computer power has come on, and technology is no longer a barrier for us starting to think about how we might do things differently and how we might do things better. So how would this work with our approach, this responsive content? Well, actually, not that differently in terms of capturing the assets. The assets are captured, but this time they're packaged up as separate objects along with some metadata that kind of describes how they should be put together at the audience's end, and then those assets can be assembled in a way that suits the audience, the environment, and their system that's being used to consume the content. So the project that I'm going to talk to you today about is one of a kind of an early prototype to how this might work. So this is not near to being an actual service or anything that's launched. It's a purely R&D project, but it's really looking at feasibility of this and trying to create a user experience that we can justify or verify how good that is as a user experience. So what we wanted to focus on really for this was the length of the program, and could we vary the length of the program? But because we are taking this approach of assets and metadata, there's a lot of other things that you could get for free for taking that approach. But binaural mixes, surround sound, being able to present a different mix for different people in different environments with the foreground and background sounds different depending on the listener. but we did focus on the variable length aspect. So how does this work? I've talked about the objects and the metadata, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those actually consist of. So we're talking about new ways of telling stories. So here we've got a kind of an example of how you might break a linear story down into chunks to present it in a dynamic way. So here each circle is a different part of a story, and this is the first section of Little Red Riding Hood that I'm going to use as an example to understand. But it's very important that how we assemble these chunks of story make logical sense to the audience at the other end. So there's a kind of a graph logic that needs to be understood. So in responsive Red Riding Hood, it's just the section of the story where Red Riding Hood leaves her house and goes to visit her grandmother. So that's the kind of quickest way that you can tell that section of the story that makes sense. But there's a longer route through this story as well. So she sets off, she arrives at the shortest. The longer route is she sets off, she packs an apple. On the way she eats the apple, she arrives at her grandmother's house. And here you can see there's kind of some yellow coding to the logic that says if she doesn't pack the apple, she can't eat the apple later. So it's kind of to ensure that eating the apple makes sense. But there's an alternative as well. Rather than packing the apple, she puts on a hood and leaves. Hopefully she's wearing some clothing in the other version of the story. I didn't say it was a good story. It's just an example. So that's an example of some of the logic that needs to be considered when you're trying to put these stories together in ways that make sense. So for responsive radio, we needed a longer story. So we worked with a story that was being produced on the writer Derek Tanguy for Radio 4. It was much more complicated than Little Red Riding Hood. So we started with a linear story and kind of followed it back and broke it up into logical chunks. And went back to the clean audio sources. I think probably the thing to emphasize here is what we're not creating is like an automatic playlist generator. It's actually a program that comes out the other end. So the music, the background sounds, etc., all need to be crafted together in a way that makes sense. So after we chunked it up into the narrative sections, we needed to collect the metadata, and it was a fairly laborious process. But actually, this data exists already in the brain of the producer, and it was a case of while the producer is editing together a feature, in their head they're thinking, well, this bit doesn't make sense here, this bit makes sense later on. But most of the time, because we're producing a linear program, that data just kind of is lost. And what we were trying to do is to capture that data and represent it digitally. And it was quite a challenge. This is an example of the very first graph that we generated to tell the story. And we had too much data, really, the first time. We were collecting loads of metadata about the subject and the mood and all this kind of stuff. And we didn't need most of it, so we managed to slim it down a fair bit. The way we delivered the experience was using HTML5 to render the objects in real time in the listener's device based on the narrative elements. And I can play you a short clip now, I think. This is the shortest possible version, or the first 30 seconds or so, the shortest possible version of the program.
There are legions of people who yearn to pack up their jobs and find some patch of land where they can create their earthly nirvana. Jeannie and I were among that number who succeeded in turning that dream into reality.
An extract from Cottage on a Cliff, one of several books collectively known as the Minack Chronicles, published throughout the second half of the 20th century. The author's name is Derek Tanguy, and the words were written at Dorminack, a remote cottage in the farthest reaches of Cornwall. In the early 1950s, Tanguy and his wife Jeannie said goodbye to their glamorous lifestyle in London's West End for a more simple existence, growing flowers and potatoes at Land's End. I'm John McCarthy, and I hope you'll join me as I take a voyage through the world of Minack and the life of Derek Tanguy, the Cornish...
So you can see and you can hear there that actually what comes out the other end is actually a finished program, and the foreground objects are kind of cut up and changed as it goes through. So, as I say, it's kind of early research. We're hoping to be able to share it with the public at some point, but there are quite a lot of boring hoops that I don't have time to go into now. Thank you very much.
This is Next Radio.
With Broadcast Bionics, innovative solutions for creative people.